Do you think Easter is all about bunnies and chocolate eggs? Get ready to discover the real story behind this ancient celebration, a story of suffering, courage, unwavering faith, and a relentless pursuit of freedom. In this video, we will delve into the epic story of the Exodus, the journey of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. Discover how this ancient narrative resonates in our day, and be inspired to fight against the oppressions that still imprison us. Get ready to learn the historical facts behind the legend of the Exodus, understand the deeper meaning of Easter symbols, reflect on what freedom really means to you, and find inspiration to overcome your own challenges. To understand the magnitude of the journey toward freedom, we need to go back thousands of years to the heart of ancient Egypt, a powerful civilization, rich in culture, and with a complex religion centered on its pharaohs, who were considered gods on earth. Egypt was a center of knowledge, art, and architecture, but also a place of rigid hierarchy and, unfortunately, slavery. In the midst of this grandeur, we find the Hebrew people. Initially, they were welcomed in Egypt, migrating there in search of food and better living conditions. Their population grew rapidly, and with this growth, the situation of the Hebrews became increasingly difficult. A new pharaoh rose to power, a pharaoh who did not remember the benefits that Joseph, a Hebrew, had brought to Egypt. Fearing the growing power of this foreign people, the pharaoh imposed brutal slavery. Life for the Hebrews became a nightmare, forced to work tirelessly. Building cities and monuments under the whip of cruel overseers, they lost their dignity and hope. The oppression was constant, the pain was palpable, and the future seemed bleak. The Hebrews cried out for deliverance, a cry that echoed across the desert until it reached the ears of a God who had not forgotten them. To deepen our understanding, let us briefly explore the social structure of Egypt at that time. Society was pyramidal, with the pharaoh at the top, followed by priests, nobles, and military men. At the bottom were peasants, artisans, and finally slaves. Slavery was a common practice and essential to the Egyptian economy. And it was in this scenario of suffering that a man emerged who was destined to change the course of history: Moses. His story begins with an act of courage and desperation. To protect him from the Pharaoh's cruel order to kill all Hebrew boys, his mother placed him in a basket and threw him into the Nile River. Divine providence guided him to the Pharaoh's daughter, who, moved by compassion, adopted him and raised him as her own son. Moses grew up in the palace, receiving an education and training as an Egyptian prince. However, he never forgot his Hebrew origins. One day, upon witnessing the brutality of an Egyptian overseer against a Hebrew, Moses, overcome by indignation, acted impulsively and killed him. Fearing the Pharaoh's wrath, he fled to the Midian desert, seeking refuge and anonymity. In the desert, Moses found a new life, marrying and working as a shepherd. But his destiny was yet to be fulfilled. One day, while tending his father-in-law's flock, Moses came across an extraordinary sight: a burning bush that was not consumed. Curious, he approached it and heard the voice of God, calling him by name and revealing his plan to free the Hebrew people from slavery. Moses hesitated, feeling inadequate for the task, but God encouraged him, promising to be with him and granting him the power to perform miracles. Obeying the divine call, Moses returned to Egypt, accompanied by his brother Aaron, to confront Pharaoh and demand the liberation of his people. We can imagine Moses' internal struggle upon returning to Egypt. He had lived for years in the palace, enjoying comfort and security, but compassion for his people impelled him to face Pharaoh and risk his own life. Pharaoh, hardened in his pride and power, refused to listen to Moses' words. He did not care about the suffering of the Hebrews, nor did he fear the God whom Moses represented. To demonstrate his power and force Pharaoh to yield, God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt, each more terrible than the last. The water of the Nile turned to blood, killing the fish and making the water filthy. Frogs invaded the land, entering homes and causing revulsion. Lice and flies plagued people and animals. A terrible plague decimated Egypt's livestock. Painful, sores covered the skin of men and animals. A hailstorm destroyed the crops. Locusts devoured everything that was left. Finally, a thick, impenetrable darkness covered the land of Egypt for 3 days. It is important to note that some interpretations suggest that some of these plagues could have had natural causes, such as weather events or outbreaks of disease. However, the intensity, sequence, and timing of the plagues point to divine intervention. Pharaoh, despite so much suffering, hardened his heart and refused to free the Hebrew people. Each plague had a devastating impact on Egypt's economy and daily life. Contaminated water, loss of livestock, and destruction of crops led to famine and despair. The 10th and final plague was the most terrible of all, the death of all the firstborn in Egypt, both man and beast. To protect his children from this tragedy, God instructed the Hebrews to perform a special ritual. They were to sacrifice a lamb without blemish and paint the doorposts of their doors with the animal's blood. This blood would be assigned to the angel of death, who would pass over their homes, sparing their firstborn. This night of protection and deliverance became known as Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew, which means to pass over. In addition to the sacrifice of the lamb, the Hebrews were also to eat unleavened bread, a bread without yeast, symbolizing the haste with which they were to leave Egypt. And they were to eat bitter herbs, to remember the bitterness of slavery. This sacred meal, celebrated to this day by Jews around the world, is a memorial of the Hebrew people's liberation from slavery in Egypt. It reminds us of the importance of faith, obedience, and hope in times of difficulty. Preparation for Passover required a thorough cleaning of homes, removing all leaven, symbolizing purification and renewal. After the 10th plague, Pharaoh finally relented and allowed the Hebrews to leave. But soon after, regretting his decision, he gathered his army and pursued them to the shores of the Red Sea. The Hebrews were trapped, with the sea in front of them and the Egyptian army behind them. Desperate, they cried out to God for help, and God once again demonstrated his power in an extraordinary way. Moses stretched out his staff over the sea, and a strong east wind blew all night, opening a path through the waters. The Hebrew people crossed the Red Sea on dry land, with the waters forming walls on either side. The Egyptian army, in its blind fury, pursued them into the sea. But when all the Hebrew people were on the other side, God caused the waters to return to their place, drowning the entire Egyptian army, including Pharaoh. The deliverance of the Hebrew people was complete. They had escaped slavery and witnessed the power and faithfulness of God. The crossing of the Red Sea is one of the most impressive miracles in the Bible, a symbol of divine deliverance and victory over oppression. We can imagine the scene of the Red Sea parting, a grand and terrifying spectacle. The Hebrew people, with faith and hope, walked in the midst of the waters, while the Egyptian army, with its arrogance and thirst for revenge, was swallowed up by the waves. But the Hebrew people's journey to freedom did not end with the crossing of the Red Sea. They still had a long way to go through the desert, facing challenges and trials. For 40 years they wandered in the desert, learning to trust God and to build a new identity as a nation. In the desert, God provided them with food, water, and protection. He gave them the law, the 10 Commandments, a code of conduct to guide and unite them. The desert was a time of purification and transformation, preparing the Hebrew people to receive the promised land. The story of the Exodus teaches us that freedom is not just the absence of physical oppression, but also inner freedom, the ability to overcome our fears and limitations, to trust in God, and to follow the path of righteousness. The story of Easter is not just an ancient tale of liberation. It remains relevant and inspiring today. In a world still marked by modern slavery, social inequality, racism, and oppression in many forms, the message of Easter resonates powerfully. It reminds us that the search for freedom is a fundamental human desire, and that hope for a better future should never be lost. Easter invites us to fight against all forms of oppression, to defend the rights of the marginalized, and to build a more just and equitable society. Just as the Hebrew people cried out for liberation, so too must we raise our voices against injustice and seek a world where all can live in freedom and dignity. Easter is a symbol of resilience, faith, and hope. a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of liberation can shine. Reflect on how you can apply the principles of Easter in your own life, seeking liberation from your own inner Egypts. Easter is a story of courage, faith, and liberation that echoes through the centuries. May this story inspire us to fight for a more just and free world for all. What does freedom mean to you? What kind of slavery do you need to overcome in your life? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. May the message of Easter renew your hope and strengthen your faith.